As the World Cup in Qatar continues, human rights groups are sounding the alarm on migrant workers enduring disturbing, widespread abuse. This sadly isn't just happening in Doha. These issues also happening right here in Ontario. And for more on this critical issue, I'm joined live now by Syed Hussan, the Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Good morning, Syed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First off, I'll start off with your reaction to some of the reports coming out of Qatar when it comes to the migrant situation there. I know last week, Qatari officials said that the deaths of migrant workers who were building some of the structures for the World Cup ranged in the hundreds, but reports have been much higher than that. What are your thoughts?
I think we have to compare what's happening in Qatar and what's happening here in Canada. So one of the biggest issues in Qatar, for example, is that migrant worker deaths. Now, this number is actually a result of the first Qatari investigation into migrant worker deaths. In Ontario, there has never been an inquest or an investigation into, for example, farm worker deaths. Similarly, the other issue in Qatar, for example, and they're saying they've made things better, is about people working in dangerous and difficult conditions, often under heat stress. And recently, more laws have been created around working in extreme weather conditions in Qatar. In Ontario, there are absolutely no laws for farm workers and other migrant workers working in extreme weather events. Similarly, in Qatar, one of the biggest issues, another big issue, is that workers are tied to the employers. They can't change jobs. And because they're tied to the employer, they're unable to speak up and make complaints. In Canada, all migrant workers are tied to their employers. So what we're seeing is actually a global system of migrant worker regimes that are very similar to each other and that result in the same kind of abuse, exploitation, and death.
And we're talking about it in this international lens here in Canada, but in Ontario, again, like you mentioned, this is happening throughout the country. But here in Ontario, can you give us a little bit of behind the scenes look at what the migrant worker situation is in the province, so people who don't realize that this is happening in our backyard can get an idea of what is the situation?
So the largest number of migrant workers in Ontario work in agriculture, following that in care work, taking care of children, sick and the elderly, and then in some other industries like construction, cooking, etc. When we look at farm workers, we have seen, for example, at least 10 deaths that have taken place in Ontario with people working because of heat exhaustion, because of accidents at work. Mr. Garvin died in a tobacco harvester recently. Other people, recently somebody died because they were biking to a laundry shop and there's no physical infrastructure and there's no laundry on their farms. So migrant workers are tied to the employers. I just, maybe this is a way to think about it. Remember, imagine if you tomorrow were working in a place where if you spoke up, you lived in your employer's home. So if you spoke up, you'd be kicked out on the street. You wouldn't be allowed to work anywhere else because you're tied to the employer. The employer could deport you from the country, which is what can happen now, and they can ban you from returning in the future, which means you can't earn money for your family. So if you could be in this situation, how much abuse and exploitation would you take? Because you don't really have any choices. Well, that's the experience of migrant farm workers in this province and other migrant workers. And the fundamental issue is that migrant workers don't have permanent resident status. This is the status that allows you to access healthcare, labor rights, be with your families, etc. So what is needed is permanent resident status for all migrants.
And what other push can you tell us about to make the, not just making migrant workers permanent residents, but is there another push so that this is amplified, this whole issue is amplified here in Ontario so that the government can make changes, inquests can be had as well to look at some of the past deaths that we've seen?
I think so. I mean, in Ontario, for example, the province has failed, like, for example, the basic labor laws, minimum wage, overtime pay, hours of work, protection when you're injured, specific reprisals against injury. All of these migrant workers are excluded from. Like, we have members who have worked 3 straight months without a single day off, 14 hours a day, and it's completely legal, and they don't get any overtime pay. And if they fall sick, they're driven to the airport and put on a flight home, right? That's all completely legal. So what we're talking about is a system of systematic abuse Recently, Jamaican Caribbean farm workers issued a letter calling their conditions systematic slavery, talked about being treated like mules, being treated worse than animals, so much so that the government of Jamaica has dispatched a fact-finding mission to investigate the conditions on Canadian farms. Despite all of this, the federal and the provincial government have not made the one change that is required. We can change other labor laws, we can change other access to healthcare laws, but at the end of the day, it's about people having the power to protect themselves. And the only way you have power to protect yourselves is if you have permanent resident status. It is the fact that they are migrants that all the other abuse are caused, whether it's in Qatar or whether it's in Canada. And so we need to change that. We need to give people the ability to be equal like everybody else. Otherwise, look, we can't have a fair society without equal rights. And you cannot have equal rights unless everyone in the country has the same immigration status.
Right.
That's just the reality. And the Canadian government knows it and has not implemented, especially in farms, because of big businesses similar to Qatar who've lobbied and pushed for fewer and fewer protections so people can be exploited.
All right, Syed, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, our time ends here, but really important to bring up this very critical issue. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
No problem.